Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Claims Corner. Glad you all could join us today and every other Thursday as we hear again, we sit and we hear from an expert in the insurance industry as they give us a perspective or insight into a specific topic. Now, we are in our third season here with doing Claims Corner. And each year we have at least one episode that is centered around a very important topic. Okay. Even our speaker today has been on and has covered this topic before. Today's episode is wind versus wave. I hope I got that title right. Anyway, wind versus water, however we want to look at it. And kind of the reason why we repeat this topic in this title and this conversation each and every year is because it is so important for adjusters, both property and flood adjusters, to comprehend your requirements as an adjuster during that claims process and to have a clear understanding of how to identify the different causes of loss. And every day we are getting closer to hurricane season. As we saw last episode, we had on Dr. Hal Needham on our last Claims Corner episode. Okay. He talked about storm predictions. He talked about how the storms are becoming stronger and a little more frequent. They're slowing down, causing a little more heavy rains and flooding in areas. And at the same time, they're bringing in higher winds. We've already seen a named storm this year. We have seen multiple areas of potential development this year. With strong storms comes multiple perils, comes the wind and the water, both at the same time. CNC not only handles claims for carriers as the single adjuster program for the single adjuster for both the wind and the flood. We also are involved in flood assignments with NFIP and private clients. And then we also involved in individual claims with the wind and hurricane assignments on the property side. So it's really vital for an adjuster to know how to identify and estimate both perils, to avoid overpayments, to avoid underpayments, incorrect coverages. We need to understand how to work with either the property or the flood adjuster. It depends on which actual claim you happen to be working on. And with the full knowledge of both perils, this gives us more control of the claims process, either as a single adjuster or working with the adjuster on that other peril. We're being able to properly identify wind and flood perils is very vital, especially when it comes to a single claim. Because it also provides when you're handling both the wind and flood, this is an excellent opportunity for great customer service. And when you're able to go out there and you're able to acknowledge and handle that with professionalism, this is excellent for the customer, the policyholder. It gives them that customer experience that they're used to, that they're, I wouldn't say used to, but that they expect because they've been paying their premiums and expecting that customer service. So with us today to help us solidify our understanding is Erik Moore of EFI Global. I understand, Erik, I've been having a little bit of technical issues, and I understand he has been having a few technical issues as well, or I shouldn't say technical, but more internet issues with stuff going in and out. The storms in the area have been causing a lot of havoc on power outages and things like that. So hopefully, Erik, are you with us right now?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. And so, Erik, like I said before, Erik has been with us before, So with that, I'm going to let Erik actually introduce himself. But since he's been with us before, you only have 10 words or less to introduce yourself, Erik. So go for it.
My name's Erik Moore.
Take all the time you have.
My name's Erik Moore. I'm a senior engineer with EFI Global, and I also manage all of the NFIP and private flood work that we see from the expert side through EFI. And I've been doing this about 15 years. I'm licensed in 45 states throughout the country, and I travel fairly extensively, and I've seen a lot. been around a while. I'm not quite old and gray like some people, but I'm slowly getting there. Mostly because I shave my head and keep it pretty short, so that way I don't pull it out in the middle of the cat. So with that, let me share my screen and we'll get right to it. Let me see. All right. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
That's perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's get started. The quote that I have here is nature is sometimes subdued but seldom extinguished. It's very appropriate for what we're talking about today. We're dealing with two natural forces, both wind and wave or water, and it's difficult to deal with Mother Nature. Even from an engineering perspective, we can do a lot of design work. We can spend a lot of money in construction, repairs, remodels to try to subdue these forces, but it's very difficult to get away from it. I just recently came back last week from a trip to North Dakota and South Dakota after the derechos that went through there a few months back. And looking at the damage up there, it was very reminiscent of what I saw in a lot of the hurricanes from Laura and Michael recently, because the construction up there is only designed for 80 to 90 mile an hour design speeds for wind, and they had 110-mile-an-hour gusts. So a lot of those old farm buildings weren't going to be able to sustain that and hold up to that. And they just weren't built that way. And even going back in the remodel process, a lot of people are not going to be required by their municipalities to build back to the same wind codes that we have down here in South Florida or along the Gulf Coast. So with that being said, let's jump right in. Here's a little rundown of what we're going to talk about today. We'll look at air pressure versus water pressure. We'll talk wave characteristics and surge. Then we'll look at the damage profiles. We'll look at hydrodynamic forces, scour, velocity flow, and then we'll get into the fun stuff, the case studies, look at all the pictures, and have some good conversation. So when we talk wind and water, it's important to realize that water weighs about 768 times more than air. You can do your own little experiment. You walk outside in a windy day, you can feel the air pushing against you, but a lot of times it's not going to knock you over. Whereas if you go down and walk into the Gulf or along the Atlantic and you get hit with a wave, that water has mass and it does hurt when it hits you, particularly if you're not expecting it. When we boil it down and we look at 1 square foot of water, just a 12-inch square, traveling at 10 miles an hour, when you do all the mental gymnastics and math, it works out to about 210 pounds a square foot of pressure. So when we equate that to a wind speed, you're looking at the equivalent wind force of about 278 miles an hour. And that's a very slow moving water, 10 miles an hour. When we take that 278 mile an hour equivalent wind force and we look at the enhanced Fujita scale for tornadoes, that's well in excess of an EF5 tornado. You see, they stopped counting EF5 at 200. But if you can imagine, if anybody had been in Moore, Oklahoma several years ago, or Joplin, Missouri, those were the latest EF5s to hit the United States. And compare that kind of damage to just a minor flood event along a river system somewhere, that is tremendous amount of damage when you look at that comparatively. So when we talk waves along the coast, the most severe forces you're dealing with are the breaking waves, that actual movement of the mass of water coming on shore. And the height of those waves are roughly calculated or estimated by zone. The V's flood zones, the waves are typically forecast to be in excess of 3 feet. In the coastal A zones, it's between 1.5 and 3 feet. And the important thing to remember about waves, they travel about 8 to 14 miles an hour. So you're getting about that 10 mile an hour average movement of the water as it comes on shore. Now you can calculate the wave height. It's typically 55% of the water depth immediately offshore, just to give you some idea. But the waves are particularly dangerous because of the cyclic and repetitive nature. The period on a wave is you're getting a new wave hitting the shore about every 6 to 12 seconds. So you're talking anywhere from 300 to 600 waves every hour impacting the structure on the coast. And that's what does the majority of the damage, particularly the lower portion of the structure that we'll see, is that repetitive pounding. I mean, a lot of buildings can take maybe 1 or 2, but when you're talking hours of this repetitive pounding that goes forth, it's very difficult to design something for that that's both cost effective and can sustain that kind of pounding. So we talk run up. That's another term you may hear. That's exactly what it is. The wave run up, as the wave breaks on the beach and the water pushes inland up the beach, that's the run up. Well, this can drive large volumes of water inland and create drag forces and localized erosion around buildings. If you have two coastal front buildings and the waves are breaking against the buildings and the water is then forced between the buildings, just like with air pressure during a windstorm, it creates that canyoning or tunneling effect that can speed the water up and cause erosion localized on those corners as it runs up. Now, when you talk run up on a vertical face, that's the water that's driven upward by the force of the sudden termination. You see this all the time whenever we have a nor'easter or a big storm up in Massachusetts. You see those very dramatic pictures on the Weather Channel. It makes for great television where they have those giant waves hitting those vertical concrete face walls along the coast, along Situate and places like that in southeast Massachusetts. And they have those giant wave washes that go 2 and 3 stories high over top of the buildings. That particular impact is so much more stronger than just the wave pushing through alone because of that driving force. So there's a lot of things to consider when you have that much volume of water moving in a small area very quickly. This is a little sketch out of the FEMA documents, give you an idea of how these things are measured and what we're talking about, where the wave run up is, how the typical coastline is oriented, and things like that. So when we look damage profile wise, typically with wind, the wind forces are going to be greatest at the top. You know, a lot of times, most places that have you get the official wind data from the airport or the National Weather Service certified site. That wind force is measured 33 feet above ground on an anemometer that's calibrated and certified by the NWS. So a lot of your one-story houses are not necessarily 33 feet, even at the peak of the roof ridge. So it's important to note that just because we had a gust of certain amount doesn't necessarily mean it was at your site at that particular amount. The other thing is wind damage is typically top down. As you'll see, a lot of times the wind damage is going to be at the upper portions of the roof, the chimney cap, the ridge caps, things like that, high up on the roof. Not necessarily the lower portions of the windows or sometimes the doors, the smaller doors, maybe not so much, but the garage doors that aren't properly um, reinforced are going to cause problems with wind pressure, depending on the amount of wind and the direction. Now, with water, when we talk damage due to water, the waves are closest to the bottom of the building. So your water damage is going to be from the bottom of the wall upward. It's rare to see water damage from a wave or a flood event happen on the second floor with no ensuing damage to the lower portions of the walls below it on the first floor. That would be something that would set my radar antennas off to look further because there's something not right here. Something is a little off. But the water damage is typically going to be from a flood down at the bottom of the wall and work its way up, where wind is going to be just the opposite. So when we talk hydrodynamic forces, in this particular figure, we're showing the water, but air pressure is monitored exactly the same. The only difference being that when we analyze the air pressure, we simply have the force of the air against the structure. We don't have the mass of the air because air has no mass. And that becomes very, very strategic when we talk water because that's why the water does so much damage is because of that mass. I mean, if I had 2-gallon jugs in front of you and on a table, and one of them's full of air and one of them's full of water, negating the weight of the jug, the jug full of air is going to be pretty easy to pick up. The gallon jug full of water is going to weigh about 8 pounds. So that mass is what's critical here. Now, with the pressure exerted, you're going to have a push against the windward side or the coastal side of the building, if you will, or the upstream side, depending on what kind of flood event we're talking. And then you'll have a pull or a drag force on the opposite side or the leeward side. So you'll have a push and a pull effect. And normally when you talk air pressure, the pull effect is sometimes greater than the actual push. So that's why you'll see a lot of problems on the leeward side as well as the windward side as that wind or water comes around the structure or over the ridge. The water pressure in particular can really destroy a foundation just from the force of the water impacting, but also it can erode, as you'll see, and cause a myriad of other problems as well. One thing when we talk hydrodynamic force, we want to look at the directionality of the water. Which way did it come from? Where's the body of water in relation to the structure that we're examining? And which direction typically would we expect the water to flow? If the river is in this behind me and the river's flowing from, say, the right side of the photograph to the left, we would expect damage from hydrodynamic forces to be right to left, everything leaning over. In this particular photo, this is in North Carolina, the sound is directly behind me in the photograph. So the water came into this side of the building, impacted the back wall, and pushed that material into the lower level. And then when we go look at the front side, you can see this area that was an enclosed garage door opening has been pushed out away from the building. And that shows the directionality of where we would expect. The surge came from the inlet behind the property, impacted the back wall, washed through the building, and then pushed out the front. If the directionality is a little screwy, that might be something to look at. Did the water come from a different direction? Was there a different source? Even in a lot of riverine flooding, you're going to see a general direction of how the current of the river flows nearest the building. Now, if you're talking the building is 2 miles away from the river and it's a backwater area, that may be a little different. But typically, if you're within a quarter mile or so of the river, the current situation, the direction is going to be relatively the same as what the river is near the property. With scour, erosion, this is the wearing away of the banks of a stream. This can happen by the movement of the water itself or with debris that the water carries as it floods. You'll have cars and building debris and large boulders and things like that that can also erode and destroy the stream banks and cause problems like this. Also, like we spoke of earlier, where that wave wash pushes between structures, the water will speed up because it's constricted. Just like if you put your thumb on the end of a garden hose, you'll have the water speed up a little bit and you'll get a little bit of pressure buildup. Same type of situation, and it'll push through that narrow opening and can cause problems along those particular corners and surfaces as well. Here's a good indication of scour. You can see in the photograph the dark lines on the side of the house where the actual ground surface used to be. And in this particular case, this is about 5 to 6 feet of erosion that had taken place here in this particular neighborhood. And also, the chimney did not get damaged by wind. The foundation actually washed out, and then the chimney collapsed because if you take a good look at the photograph, notice the roof structure of that house being almost 2.5 stories high. There's hardly any, or I see no wind damage to the shingles. There's no missing shingles. The ridge cap's intact. So it would be very difficult to say that we had a lot of wind damage here. The siding is still intact as well. Now you have a little bit of fascia damage there near the chimney, but I would argue that that particular portion was damaged when the chimney collapsed as a result of the flood and had nothing to do with any kind of high wind. Now, when we talk velocity flow, again, we're looking for directionality. In this picture, next door, the house next door, you notice that that house has been moved off its foundation. That front wall that you see nearest you in the photograph of the displaced house used to sit on that what's remaining of a masonry wall there in the foreground of the photograph. This building was moved about 30 feet laterally from the impact of the floodwater during the storm event and moved off its foundation. And again, you notice that we have a few shingles missing on the roof, but if wind were the proximate cause here to move the structure off the foundation such as this, I would expect a lot more damage to this building, roof system, as well as adjacent structures. Look at the garage, for instance, that is fully intact, as well as look at the vegetation as well. The trees are fairly intact. They still have a lot of leaves on them. So a lot of times with a wind event, you'll see the trees are toppled over and things like that. And particularly the garage, with that door being open and if the wind pressure came from the back of, hitting me in the back as I'm taking this photograph, blowing into that garage door, if the garage door was compromised with that much pressure to remove this house from the foundation, that garage structure would have been pressurized and for certain we'd have lost the back wall of the garage, if not portions of the roof, because of the overpressurization of the building. So in this case, this again is all related to flood. Now with floodborne debris, I'm sure a lot of you run into this when you get on the outside of the structure, floating debris, cars. We saw a lot of this in Ellicott City, Maryland years ago when they had the flash flood event with all the cars washing through town and things like that, bumping into buildings and stuff like that. Boats, piles, docks are another big one. I always love the advertisement on TV for the throw fluid decking for the dock. You put this mesh recycled product, like a plastic mesh for your dock, and the storm surge can flow through it. the product works fantastic, but your neighbor has to have it as well. If he's got an old wood dock and his old wood dock washes out in the storm and knocks into your brand new super expensive through flow decking, you're in the same boat. You're still going to have a bunch of matchsticks to clean up and put back together after the storm. The main takeaway here is, as you see in the photograph, you've got a lot of impact damage to this particular structure with those pilings that had broken through and pounded the wall. Keep in mind, though, that debris impact from a flood event cannot just be restrained to the exterior. Depending on what part of the country that you're in, when you get into a basement situation that fills with water very quickly, there's a lot of things in the basement that can break away, such as dryers are notoriously light and float very quickly and can bounce around and displace and cause damage, maybe knock out an interior column or something of that nature. Hot water heaters are the same way. The big problem, that again, depending where you are in the country and the age of the building, your oil storage tanks for heating oil in the basements, if they're not properly strapped down or the strapping is deteriorated, those can pop off and wash around in the house, in the basement. And that's just like a giant fishing bobber. I mean, the old saying, oil's lighter than water. Well, you have 250 gallons of water or of oil in a tank bouncing around down there. And some of you have seen the size of those tanks. That can very easily knock out a 4-inch lolly column or maybe a small masonry pilaster that's supporting an interior beam and cause problems. So don't just think of impact damage from flood debris as an exterior problem. It can also be an interior problem as well. When we talk surge, I mean, anybody that's been around in the last 4 or 5 years doing anything with flood or wind, you've seen a lot of surge. With Michael, there was a lot of surge. Laura had a lot of surge. Ida had a lot of surge. Seems like every year we get a really big storm here lately that's got a big storm surge potential. And the surge is really made up of two components. You have the wind-blown water that's a very large part of it, but also the pressure wave as well. And really, the wind is a resultant of that rapid change in pressure going from low to high. The wind is racing back, trying to equalize itself, and you get that kind of high winds and the surge of water on shore. But don't let a public adjuster try to talk you into the storm surge is all due to the wind, because that's a load of crap. I don't know how many of you have might have seen one of these. I'm still looking to find an updated one or one for the Atlantic coast, but this is called a Slosh Model. It's done by FEMA. This is a fairly older one. It's maybe put out in the early 90s. But what represented here is the storm surge elevation at various locations along the Gulf Coast. If you look up the vertical axis to the left side, you'll see the storm surge elevation in feet. Then along the horizontal axis at the bottom, you see different locations laid out. It starts on the left with Galveston, Texas, and it goes across to Longboat Key, Florida. So this primarily runs the entire Gulf Coast. Now, when looking at the different lines, the yellow line at the bottom is the for a Category 1 estimated storm surge based on the ocean floor topography near these locations and the topography of the land at the water's edge and all that kind of good stuff. Then you have the middle lines, kind of an orangish color. That's a Cat 3. And then the red line at the very top is a Cat 5. So if we want to see how accurate this is, let's just take a couple of, take an opportunity to look at this a little bit. If you look down towards the right-hand side of the photograph, probably a quarter of the way to the left, you'll see there's St. George Island, Mexico Beach, Mexico B right there. If you follow that up vertically from that Mexico B, you'll notice that that intersects right about that red line for a Cat 5 intersects about 20 feet of storm surge. And after Hurricane Michael, that's what we were seeing in Mexico Beach area, was anywhere between 18, 19, 20 feet of storm surge. If you look a little bit further to the left and get a little bit further over into the Louisiana side, you will be able to find, wait a minute. You will see a few areas here for Hurricane Katrina. That was a Cat 3, say Gulfport, Biloxi. A Cat 3 is around the same thing, about 20 to 22 feet for a Cat 3. And again, that's what we were seeing in Hurricane Katrina for the storm surge there. Notice too that area from like Grand Isle, Louisiana, up through Pascagoula, Mississippi, up to Dolphin Island, that area has a very high area of storm surge because of the topography of the ocean floor right there. It's very shallow, and therefore it can impact the development of the storm surge very quickly and have a very severe storm surge, as opposed to, say, a little bit further to the east towards Pensacola Beach or Destin. But allegedly, it's been rumored for several years that FEMA's coming out with an updated model of this for the Gulf Coast, as well as developing one for the East Coast of the U.S. So I've been trying to find one. I haven't yet, but as soon as I do, I'll add it to the presentation, because I'm very interested to see how storm surge would affect places like Savannah, Georgia, Jacksonville, Florida, places along the Chesapeake Bay. I think would be interesting to see how that would all shape out. All right, come on. So let's take a look at some pictures. If you notice in this photograph, we have no structure. I get a lot like this, particularly after big storms. But take a look around. Notice how clean the site is. We have not a lot of debris. There's some. The trees are somewhat intact, but not totally so. They're missing most, if not all, of their leaves. We still have a nice looking tile floor here, but all the framing's gone. The structure itself is gone. And notice in the toward the right side of the picture, about 2/3 of the way up the right side, you can see the water right there. So we're very close to the coast. This was over in Biloxi, I believe, after Hurricane Katrina. This is all water related damage. And the thing that you'll look at first when you first get to the site is it's either going to be really, really messy, like my cousins used to be when we played together as kids. They come over your house like a whirlwind, they dump all the stuff out and mix up all the pieces of your board games, and then they leave and you're left with a big mess. Or you clean everything up when you're done and put it away like a nice kid, and clean your room up and put everything back where it goes. Flood is usually the nice kid. It cleans up after itself. Not saying it doesn't make a big mess, but in a situation like this, a lot of the debris that's generated from the flood event, when the tide and the surge go back out to sea, it takes a lot of that debris with it. Whereas wind just kind of swirls everything up like a blender, and wherever it falls, it falls. So keep that in mind as we're going through. Here's another photo. Again, notice the collapsing of the front wall of the building. The ocean in this picture is behind me in the photograph. So the water came into the front wall of the house and collapsed it. You'll notice too, on a lot of times when the flood compromises a wall of the building, the house will kind of nose forward toward the water, kind of bow down toward the water, if you will. And that's a very good indication of flood related damage. But again, take a look at the roof structures here, the trees. Notice the trees, these have some leaves. They don't have a lot, but they're still standing. It doesn't look like Hurricane Michael, where we had a lot of these lodgepole pines that were snapped off 15, 20 feet up in the air, and they're all snapped the same direction for acres and acres and acres. You got a little bit of what looks to be wind damage on that roof structure toward the middle, but I think we could make a fairly good argument that that's more than likely wave wash that removed those shingles once the roof structure collapsed into the water before the flood had receded. Because look at the structure in the background there with the lighter colored shingles. The turbine vents are still in place. There's no shingles hardly missing off of that roof. So I think we could make a pretty good case for this one that it's all related to the flood event. Here's the backside of that one that looked pretty good over there. You can see the turbine sticking up there. Again, notice the building has collapsed. The roof structure dropped down apparently into the floodwater, and through the wind and the floating was driven back into this tree. You notice that the roof section has been driven over the tree probably, 10 to 12 feet, maybe a little bit further, until it ran into some resistance there from the hip bridge. But again, notice the roof section. It's in fairly good shape. We don't have a lot of missing shingles. We still got a turbine vent. So I would be very, very easy to say that, again, this is related to flood and not so much wind. Now take a look at this one. This is what I was talking about, the messy kid versus the clean kid. Look at this particular house. You've got a lot of shingle damage, particularly at the ridge and along the edges. You've got a lot of tree damage, a lot of trees broken. You've got an uprooted tree in the front. Take a look at the car parked there in the corner. That guy must have had a pretty rough night. This one is all related to wind. Again, notice how messy the site is from all the debris. This was taken in Tuscaloosa after the big tornado up there. I want to say that was in 16, if memory serves, either 14 or 16. But this is nowhere near the water. And you'll notice again here, now this one, a little bit different. Got a pretty good looking house. The roof's intact. Most of the siding's intact. But again, notice the front wall of the house. If you notice down in the lower left corner, there's a few little CMU blocks laying there. That is the front wall of the house where the front wall used to be. And you notice how all of the intermediate piers in the middle that supported the ridge, the roof ridge and walls on the inside, they've all been lifted out of the ground and the house has been displaced off the foundation. This was over in Cape San Blas after Hurricane Michael. They had about 6 to maybe 8 feet of water go through here. So this house was displaced off its foundation. But notice again, the roof's in fair shape, no missing panels that we notice, no windows blown out. There's not even hardly any siding missing. But this one's displaced off its foundation. And now on this lot, I was over there about a year ago. They've now built a structure, a brand new house that is probably 4 times this big, but it's also like 15 or 16 feet up in the air. So this won't happen again. Take a look at this one. Again, notice the clutter around, the down trees. Notice the shingles missing from the roof, particularly on the right side, so we know which direction maybe the wind came from that right side, peeling the shingles off as it went across the roof. And again, notice how messy the site is versus, say, this one that was not as much wind but more flood. Notice how relatively clean the site is. You don't have a lot of debris laying around and things like that. This one, again, was in another neighborhood in Tuscaloosa after the tornado. Now take a look at this one. This was an old Hurricane Sandy one. Kind of threw this one in there as a little bit of a loop. You notice the structure, the front face of the structure there that's displaced down where that big semicircular window is. The Atlantic Ocean is directly behind me in the photograph. That's the back of the building facing the water. Probably at this time, it might have been 80 yards, maybe 100 yards behind me. The large slabs that you see in the foreground there, that was part of a sidewalk system that ran about 30 yards in front of this building or behind this building down along the ocean side. So when the surge came in during Sandy up in Jersey, it picked up these slabs that were unreinforced just sitting on the sand and used them as battering rams to just batter these houses that were oceanfront. And that's exactly what happened here. These slabs impacted that back wall, pushed it in, the house dropped down. But take a look at the roof structure here and the missing shingles. We have 2 layers of shingles on here, but you notice that they're all pushed off at the corner. But look at the rest of the house. The siding's intact in the gable end here. Along the ridge, there's no missing ridge vent. There's no shingles missing up top, just this lower corner. This one is all related to flood. When the house collapsed and this part of the roof structure fell down, similar to the other one that we saw, the wave wash, it happened during the flood while the tide was still in, and the wave wash peeled these shingles off of the roof in this particular fashion. It had nothing to do with wind. But the PA tried to make a good case, but no, there wasn't. Sandy was not typically a wind event in most cases. It was much, much more a flood event, particularly in this part of Jersey. There was hardly any wind with it at all. It was mainly a flood event. Now, this one is a little bit different. Notice in the photograph, the front wall of the house to the left there and the corner of the masonry stem wall. That's where the building was. It's been displaced about 4, maybe 6 feet laterally off of the front, and then also kind of twisted around on the backside there. Got a lot of damage, a lot of siding damage. Parts of the roof are missing. Look at the gable end here on the left side. A lot of siding missing up top. So this one's a little tricky because normally with wind, you don't see houses typically moved off of the foundation. But in this particular case, that's exactly what happened. This was an older house up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, that was hit with that tornado a few years back. And it was actually slid off of the foundation and kind of rotated several feet. Now, you notice there's a lot of roof damage here in the right side of the picture and a lot of siding damage from impact and debris flying around. This was all wind related. And it's kind of odd because you usually don't see wind moving the structures off of their foundations a lot. You see the wind tearing up the upper portions of the structures, but not necessarily displacing the entire building from its foundation. Now, this one is interesting. I don't know how many of you have seen this location. This is Mexico Beach, right as you enter from the west, coming in from Panama City. None of these houses are here anymore. They've all been torn down. But this is a unique situation. This is a little bit of both. Again, we had fairly substantial storm surge. These houses are about 12 feet to that lower beam that you see for the first floor. So we definitely had some substantial water in here. Now, the question is what happened here? This is a little bit of both. We did have some flood, but the reason these two buildings on the right are collapsed versus the one on the left that is not, they were all built at the same time by the same builder. They're virtually identical, with one exception. The family room in the backside of these structures, on the two that you see that are displaced off of the walls, they had a wide open 2-story kind of cathedral ceiling type look. The one that you see still standing did not. They had 2 bedrooms back there, and they had some more lateral stability with the interior walls built in. That's why that one is still up and the other two aren't. So even though we had water do some damage here, the major proximate cause that caused this displacement of the structures was the wind. And also furthering the argument for the wind, because of the design of the structures, you notice they're very narrow and very long. In earthquake engineering, this would be known as what we call a short story failure, where you get a lot of movement and then the walls on the first floor collapse because of the short story and because of the geometry of the building. That's what ends up happening. And that's exactly what happened here, only it was from the wind buffeting and causing the movement, not necessarily the earthquake. And it was just a matter of cascading failure. Once the first one went into the second one, that knocked the second one over until we finally hit the third one, which was a little more rigid and didn't end up falling over. It did end up out of plumb. As you can see, it's certainly racked there above the first floor from the impact of the adjacent building, but it managed to regain its integrity and not completely collapse like the other two. This is another one from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the tornado. This is a church. Again, notice that we have a lot of roof damage, a lot of problems up high, not so much down low. I mean, they have a few windows blown out there on the left side, which could have been from flying debris and whatnot, not unusual. But you notice a lot of the roof structure, a lot of the roof covering is missing, particularly on the left side where the wind swept came in from. And here you can also notice on that little gable portion, kind of to the right of the steeple and the tower, you notice how the wind, if it came across from the right and hit that and went over, you notice how we've got the impact of the wind on that one side where the most of the decking is missing on that little gable piece, and then the rest of it on the other side has been pulled off as well. This was all related to wind. I can tell you that climbing that steeple with all that copper trim at the top that's been spiraled off was not fun, but the client wanted to know what was up there. So luckily I had someone that was a free climber did a lot of rock climbing in their spare time. And we were able to get those guys up there to take a look at it, because I don't mind going up high, but when I start doing things like that, that's a special kind of crazy. Now let's take a look at this one. Talking wind versus surge again. Look at this place. We're talking wind. We have very few shingles missing off the roof. No siding missing. Look at the neighboring house. Again, no shingles missing off the roof. But pay special attention to these awnings on the second floor windows here. Those are canvas awnings stretched over a very thin metal frame. If we had any kind of appreciable winds to cause the structure to displace from its foundation like this, I would not expect those particular very lightweight and very fragile structures to still be intact. They're not even ripped. So I really feel this is all related to flood, which it was. We had a foundation wall failure down here due to hydrostatic pressure, and then once that happened, the house collapsed. But that is probably the best example of differential foundation movement that you're going to see ever, because one side moved in relation to the other. It moved quite a bit. And again, in this one, notice again, we've got quite a bit of soil missing around the house, probably anywhere from 5 to 6 feet. My congratulations go out to the masonry contractor who installed those front stairs that are still hanging there. That's impressive construction to have them still be here. But again, take a look. There's no shingles missing off the roof. There's no shingles missing off the neighboring roof to the right in the photograph. Siding's intact. Again, this is all related to flood. The only difference between this house and this house is the water did not take out and did not collapse the foundation here. It just was enough. This was more than likely either a fill area at one time, or this was an area that was overdug for the initial excavation when the structure was built, and they backfilled it over the years, or once the structure was complete. So it's not naturally compacted. It's not mechanically compacted. It's just kind of more than likely dumped in there to kind of fill in the hole. And when you had that much water, it's not nearly as difficult as natural ground for that water to percolate through and get those soil grains buoyant and moving around. And that's exactly what we had happen here. Now take a look at this one. This is one of my favorites. This was in eastern Pennsylvania, up in the Lehigh Valley. This lady's house was an old farmhouse built in the 1890s. And the old lady that owned it when we were there, she was born in that front room there to the right where the hatch to the basement's open, leaning against the window. It had been in her family for like 150 years. And it was interesting. I walked up and she's like in her 90s. And I said, how deep was the water here, ma'am? And she said, well, she said, I think it was just below the window. I said, okay. So I started walking up to the front porch and unfolding my stick rule to measure. And she come over and put her arm around me. And she says, no, honey, not the first floor window. This is the upstairs window. We measured almost a 30-inch water line on the second floor of this house. So you can imagine that entire one-story addition there to the left of the main house was completely inundated. The reason you see the large gap in the wall there on the backside, there was actually an addition that was constructed here over a crawl space back in the 80s as their family got larger. The large piece that you see laying in the pine tree over there, that was a deck that was on the other side of the addition. And this row of CMUs that you see here is the guys walking into where the generator's sitting in the gas can. That was actually a one-car garage. The water came through the valley, and she witnessed it all. She was up on the side of the mountain about a half a mile away watching it through binoculars. And the water came down the valley about 6 feet deep and then gradually built to about 20. And it impacted the garage, spun the garage into the addition, and then tore the addition off the house and washed it downstream. We walked downstream, down beyond the house, kind of into the photograph, about a half a mile, and could not identify any piece of debris that belonged to this house. So, and the bad part was the house ended up having to be destroyed because, given its older construction, the balloon framing versus the conventional framing of today, we're not able to do the repairs, and the building department felt that it was better to take it down. And again, once you get into all the water mitigation and things like that, it's probably, even though it's technically feasible to repair, it's probably not economically possible because of the vast amount of money that you got to put in. But again, without knowing the story, you look at, and the gutters are intact, the fascia's intact, the roof system's intact, the pine trees all look good. This one, again, nothing but flood here. Now, this is an interesting one. Again, notice the roof, no shingles missing. I'm not sure if I can say there was fascia along that the end of that gable, the lower portion of that gable side or not. This is over in Braithwaite, Louisiana after Isaac. I think this was 2012. They had numerous houses that floated off of their elevated foundations and washed around. This one was a very interesting one. This is the only one I could stop to get quick pictures of. They had one a little further down the highway. The house had come to rest perpendicular to the highway, and the Corps of Engineers had just run a bulldozer through it to open the road. They didn't move the house. So when you drove through the old house, you could look up and see pictures still on the walls and things like that, appliances still in the kitchen. It was very wild. And a lot of times over here, too, with the elevated burials, a lot of the crypts will displace or open up. There was a lot of coffins floating around and things of that nature. So you never know what you're going to find. But this one here, clearly all water. There's no roof damage. The little porch roof, again, if this was substantial amount of wind to cartwheel this thing or move it off its foundation, we would see much, much greater damage to the structure. Now, this one is a very good photograph illustrating one of our points about directionality. If you take a good look at the structure, notice that roof is in very good condition. The siding on the upper portion of the house behind it is in good condition. That little roof to the right of the house in the background, again, is in good shape. The ocean here, this is in New Jersey. The ocean is directly behind me across the street, maybe 100 yards. And this house was built in the 50s. It was just toenailed onto these foundation members. And when the surge came from Sandy, it impacted that front wall and literally just dislodged the whole house into the neighbors. But again, notice not hardly any wind damage whatsoever. This is all related to flood. Now take a look at this one. This is, you notice we have missing roof decking and missing roof structure here on the left. The trees, the bark has literally been spun off some of the trees. You have substantial roof decking damage and gable end wall missing there. But again, notice how messy the scene is. This was Oklahoma City. I believe it was in 15 after the tornado. Massive damage, widespread damage. This was not too far away from the elementary school where the children were killed during the tornado. So this was right in the heart of the path of the twister. And again, same thing here. This used to be a house. It's gone. But again, notice the site, how cluttered it is with debris, the broken trees. If this was a flood event that did this, the trees would not be in this particular kind of shape. I mean, from these types of EF5 tornadoes that we saw in Joplin and Oklahoma City, I was seeing tree bark. It was actually spun and rotated off the trunks. The winds had literally pulled blades of grass out of the ground from the sod. I mean, it was very, very unique situation that the wind was just so powerful here. But again, this is all wind related, nothing to do with flood. Same thing here. Notice we got a lot of roof damage, both structures. We got portions of the roof missing here to the left on the main structure, some walls blown out. And that's typically what you see when you have a lot of high wind like this from a major tornado. This is, again, Oklahoma City. The wind pressure comes in on those gable end walls, and if the gable ends are not reinforced like they are down on the coast for the high winds, the wind will actually dislodge that gable end wall. And then once the wind is inside the structure, it's all bets are off. It begins to pressurize the attic. It'll pop down the sheetrock, and you'll see a lot of nail pops if it's not a lot of pressure. But if it's a lot of pressure, the sheetrock's going to go. Then you start seeing windows, doors, portions of the roof decking start to go. Whatever the next weakest connection is going to fail, depending on how quickly the wind and what strength the wind is when it comes through the structure. This was another building that was kind of interesting. This was the hospital in Oklahoma City, in Moore, Oklahoma, that was destroyed. You notice there's a pretty good steel beam laying there that used to be the framework for the upper floor that's now gone. I used to have it in the picture. I don't know if you can still see it or not here, but if you notice kind of directly behind the light tower that's up, that little piece of wall framing up there, there was a Nissan Sentra that was on the third floor of the building that used to be or started off in the parking lot on the other side of the building. But this was an eaves-clad metal frame building, did not hold up well at all to any kind of wind-related issues, debris impacts, and whatnot. But again, notice how cluttered the site is. And this is about a week after the storm, so there had been a lot of cleanup done. Nobody had gone into the building yet, and we had to go in and assess. This was interesting because we had to have coordinate with the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for the radioactive medicines that were involved. We had to have the CDC and the health department involved for all the bodily fluids that were stored here, the blood, the test samples, all that kind of good stuff. There was a morgue in the lower floor of the building that had, I believe, 6 or 8 bodies in it that we had to deal with. It was very interesting, as well as all the other stuff that comes with the hospitals and things like that. So, yeah, it was a fun job to work through, but the wind really did a number here. Now, this is an interesting one, and you don't see this very often, and that's why I put it in here. This is a concrete house that is covered with this stucco veneer, almost like a tile floor type situation here vertically. They had these sections of insulation that were mounted to the concrete block wall with patties of mortar, and then they put the stucco coating over top. This was in Pensacola, Florida, after a tornado. Well, it was a waterspout that became a tornado. It came off the bay kind of directly behind this place. But you don't see stucco removed from masonry walls very often from wind. That's why this one was so unique. You notice the windows blown out up top there in the picture. There's a lot of drip edge and roof damage here that you can see in the photograph. And you notice the pile of debris here down on the front. That's exactly what happened, was from the wind. When the twister came off of the bay and hit this building, the winds whipped around this corner, and somehow the pressures were great enough to get a hold of that veneer and start pulling it off like that. And I think this particular case had a lot to do with how this particular veneer was installed. This is a very different type of installation. Normally, that you would have an issue here where this would go on pretty quick. The veneer is directly applied to the masonry. Another picture of the hospital showing a lot of impact damage from wind. You see some missing roofing there on the right. This was a particularly interesting one, a little bit of both. Notice the structure is a little bit racked, and then you've got some missing dock boards here on the lake. The docks are almost all of them are going to be related to water, particularly when they're only 12, 18 inches above the surface of the water on a normal day. But as you go through and look, you'll be able to see where some of these the nail heads have actually retracted. In some cases, I've actually seen where the nail head will fold up like a taco as the board is removed from the water pressure underneath. Wind won't do that. That's going to be from the water from underneath. And you notice the structure here out front where everything is kind of racked and twisted. This was more of a design issue because a lot of these connections only had one bolt, and it's very difficult to stop rotation if you only have one fastener. You need two to keep that rotation from happening around the connections. But the structure was definitely racked by wind, and we can tell what direction the wind came from when we step back and look at the missing shingles on that right side and how the entire structure is kind of shifted and racked. And you notice too that the dock is not very far off of the water. So we had a pretty good storm, got the lake churned up and caused some damage here. I'll skip through this one pretty quick. This was a Hurricane Florence file that this is what it started off like. This is what it looked like after the first hurricane went through. The guy didn't do any repairs. And this is what it looked like when we got there after Florence. Had a ton of erosion through the seawall. The building collapsed as a result. And you notice the toilet there in the photograph. I give kudos to the plumber. That is one heck of a mounting job on the toilet to the slab. It's still there. But this had all to do with the damage to the wood frame seawall and the ocean you see right there in the background. When Florence went by from, was it Matthew? Florence was first, then Matthew, or Matthew and Florence. It was those two. The property was damaged by the first one. The guy took a year to get the permits and all that to fix the property. Didn't get the permits in time to do the work, and then the second storm hit, and this was the result. They ended up losing the house, and quite a bit of erosion took place, as you can see. The neighbor had a concrete capped sheet pile bulkhead that was much better than the wood frame one that our fellow had, and as a result, the neighbor's house is still there, and this guy's house is not. But again, you notice not a lot of wind damage here. The roof is in pretty good shape. We had a little bit where the upper decks kind of flipped over the house, but primarily here, this was a lot of more than half water damage. This is one I really wanted to spend a little bit of time on. This is how you figure it out when you show up and there's nothing left. This house was about 250 feet from the Gulf. This is what it looked like from Google Earth when it was built, probably around 85. When I got there after Michael, this is what it looked like. There's nothing left. So question is, which came first, the flood, the wind? How do we separate the baby here? So we started looking around, and you notice too that the structures here between us and the Gulf, they've got some wind damage, but they're still there. There's structures behind us that are still there, but a lot of damage. So we figure out what the elevation of the slab is. We know it was wood framed, and we can tell from a lot of the property appraiser information in county documents that what it has, what it was, and all that. But to figure out was it wind or flood, we got to look a little deeper. So here what we do is kind of spiral out from the center of our structure and look at neighboring properties, find out if we see damage or a water line or some indication of what's going on, and to figure out how deep the water was here and what exactly went down. So we look at the house, one of those elevated houses across behind us, between us and the Gulf, and we see one of the timber beams up in the air about 14, 15 feet that's got some lateral damage and displacement from floating debris. So we know the water was at least this high. And again, if you notice, a lot of the marsh grass is a good indication because this stuff floats everywhere during a hurricane. And when you find marsh grass tucked in around fasteners and things like that, the wind doesn't blow it in there. The wind didn't tuck it under that strap. The water did. It floated into there. So we know the water here was about 14 or 15. The real key piece of information that I need to solve this mystery is this CompuWeather report. I can get them for a specific time, a specific address or a town. The problem is I got to wait. I get the job like 2-3 weeks after the storm. Everybody wants to close the file, get the insured paid, all that kind of good stuff. it takes time to develop and compile this information for CompuWeather to be able to get it out. So it might take, a couple months maybe to get this information. And what they provide is this. They give you a timeline of the wind gust versus sustained winds. The gusts are the yellow squares at the top, the sustained winds are the black diamonds. And then the bar graph shows you how the surge built. Now there's an updated version of this that we got that has the surge a little bit higher than 16. I think it was like 18 and a half or something. But this is the map for Mexico Beach. And you notice as the water comes in at 11 o'clock, we're at 7 feet. So we're probably at this point already over or very close to the top of the first floor of our building. So the second floor is still out of the water at 70-mile-an-hour winds. Then we're probably starting to see some shingles crease and things like that. As we go forward to 12, the water's now elevated a little bit more. We're up to 100 miles an hour. And then the big jump takes place at 1 o'clock, where we go from almost 12 feet to a little over 16. And we have the most severe winds that we're going to, 155 sustained. At this point, we're losing shingles, we're losing decking, the attic's probably been compromised, the upstairs is probably now getting destroyed from wind, as well as the downstairs is being, if it hasn't already collapsed from the storm surge, it's at least underwater at this point. So what do? We know how the winds affect structures. This is from ASCE 716. This is the areas where you look for wind damage first. Your highest wind pressures are going to be the edges, discontinuities, the corners of the building, depending on your building and roof configuration here. So if we're going to have wind, this is where it's going to occur first before it starts happening somewhere else. So we know we had wind and water. So what happened first? Well, we know when the water was 8 feet deep, we still were having problems with the roof, and the waves are cyclic. So you got floating debris, all that kind of stuff happening. More than likely, the south wall of the first floor was defeated by wave, but we don't know exactly when that occurred. The first floor is battered by waves. The second floor collapses downward if it isn't already blown apart. But more than likely, the second floor took the brunt of the wind, and everything was washed away when the tide receded. So in this particular one, I said that they don't always come out this clean. The first floor was water. The second floor was wind. They don't always shake out like this. It just depends on how the building is. But I will tell you that this particular diagram, each storm has a little different profile. They all have their own personality. Michael was a very fast-moving storm, as indicated by the very tight peaks there. If I were to look at this for a Sally storm, it would not be as high, but it would be much, much wider because the storm moved so slow. Same thing with Harvey. When it came into Port Aransas, it had a very sharp peak, but then it slowed way down. So each storm is going to be a little bit different in what that profile looks like, and it takes time to get that information to show. So I'll finish up with this. Notice the wind versus water. You notice the roof is intact. We're missing a wall. I can tell you that this is all water because I was there the next day when they opened the locks on the dam in Missouri, and the thing flooded for the third time in 2 weeks. So yeah, the police actually had to come through and run us out of here as I was doing inspection for the first 2 flood events. And the cop told us we had 20 minutes to evacuate, and in 18 minutes, I was standing ankle deep in water, and we drove up on the hill about 100 yards away, and I took this picture as the water got back up. The last 2 times it flooded, it had about a foot of water in it, and then the second time it was up to the eaves, and the water wasn't done rising when I took this picture, so there's no telling how deep it got after I left. And this fellow was a half a mile from the river that emanates from Table Rock Lake, and when they opened the floodgates for the first time ever, this is what ended up happening. So somebody made a calculation. Oops. But there's a little recap of what we covered. If anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot them into the chat window, and I will try to get them looked at here. And there's my contact info. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to get a hold of me or talk to Craig or Julie. They know how to get a hold of me as well.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate all this information. Really some very valuable information, explanations. You know, what I really like to see, it's always nice to see explanations that are presented with photographs that you can actually see it. It's obvious you've been out, you've seen many losses, and you provided some really detailed expert reporting and all this. And it's nice to see that, not just a bunch of slides with a bunch of words on there, but really when you're talking about it, you see what you saw, which is always good because that helps adjusters out there when they need a property or flood, whatever they happen to be. they can, visually remember, oh, when we were talking about this is, I remember seeing this, and this is why this is how scouring is, and how, it's important to identify those little things. And now you actually can see it, which I think is pretty cool. It's important you brought up a couple of things that I'll touch base on. I think Julie may have some questions that have been brought up, but you brought up some important things like the directionality. And this is, to me, that's really important when it comes to a total loss. Because, as a flood adjuster, or even a property adjuster, we really need to understand what came first. Was it the wind or the wave? You have a house that's completely gone, and you're looking around, you're going, okay, what happened here? What caused this? You brought up a good point, like I think you called them the clean kids or the good kids.
Yes.
That's the water. And I've seen that before. And you're 100% right. It's the surge will come in, and if it pushes a house in a certain direction or pushes the debris, it's going to, like you show. And I saw that, and I've seen those hundreds of those photos after Katrina, where the slab is just completely clean and all the debris has been pushed. It could be 100 feet, it could be 400 yards away, but it's all piled up. It's almost like somebody just took it and just stacked it up and all nice and clean. And then when the water came back out, it just took the rest of the debris with it. And you made a good point as well. Everything will be pointing in a direction. It's not like the wind where things are scattered and the messy cousins come along and they just throw stuff around, and you got stuff in the trees and you got stuff on the ground. It's all scattered. And it's really good for adjusters to be able to identify that, to be able to go out and say, this is wind, or this is flooding. And I'll point out is, as an adjuster, we're not the experts. We're not out there to say the final determination of causation is blank. That's not our duty out there as an adjuster when we get into this wind versus wave assessment. We're not able to really identify that. But it's very beneficial for us to understand, like you're pointing out to us and showing us, is to look at it and understand how this occurred, how the damages occurred, what peril it is. We can go out there and you can look and you see the bottom floor gone and the roof's intact. And you immediately go, okay, this is from surge. The roof's torn up and the bottom floor is intact. This is from wind, and be able to identify those things. It's extremely important for adjusters to be able to do that. And when we do discover those different perils and different causations, we have to make sure we are photographing the other perils. It is really crucial for an adjuster to make sure we're documenting that. So I can't stress how important that is, because a lot of times, and I think you pointed out in some of these photographs, is, we'll go out there and we'll look at the damages and we'll see the damage. We'll take photographs. And then the policyholder goes in there and starts cleaning everything up. And then later on down the road, a month later, engineer like Erik's brought in, and he goes out there and half the house is cleaned up, half the debris is removed, half the stuff's down, half of the evidence has been, if you want to classify it as it, has been removed. And so now, what is he going to rely on to determine, is this wind or is this flood or whatever other causation that happened to be? What is he going to be able to rely on? Well, hopefully, what you should have done is taken the proper photographs, even wind adjuster, flood adjuster, whatever happens to be, and showing those other perils so that we can reference those back and go back and say, hey, here's what I saw in this photograph. This helps us determine what the cause is. So it's really important that, and that's even if you have to walk down the street to look for this debris. Like we saw in the lady's house, you got to go around and identify where there's this, find the supporting evidence, be able to look at that. We talked about total losses at the beginning real quick. We're looking at that. I will point out that, remember, as a flood adjuster, we have to complete adjuster preliminary damage assessment form. In most of those pictures that I saw, most likely the flood damages exceeded 50% of the market value of those buildings, most of the stuff that I saw. And so we have to remember that. That's one of the things, as I call them, triggers that automatically go off as I'm looking at your photos, immediately going, okay, non-waiver. Oh, an adjuster preliminary damage assessment form, because this appears to be more than 50% damage from apparel. And we have to remember to document those things. And just like with the photographs, like I talked about, the other perils, making sure we're properly identifying those things. And I will point out one thing. It's good to see that photograph of the dock, but remember, as a flood adjuster, the docks, wharves, bulkheads, are not covered. So again, Erik, very valuable information. It's important for us to talk about these things, what you're seeing, how we're seeing it, when we're going out there as an adjuster, what helps you to do your job better, what helps us, what do we need to do in order to help prove that? Because at the ultimate, we're doing our job out there for the success of the claim settlement, to make sure that claim settled properly. So if we're missing these little steps here and there, then we miss those opportunities to reach that settlement faster. And that's what we want to do, or we're not overlooking something that causes this issue, or which I've seen plenty of times, which I hate, is a file going to trial where there's an attorney involved, or like you point out, a PA gets involved, and then the PA becomes, then they make a bigger mess of the whole claims process. But anyway, good information. Julie, any questions for Erik?
No, sir.
No, really? Well,
Wow.
Erik, I guess you just hit it out of the ballpark again. So,
Well, I'll leave you with two tidbits of information. One is the pictures are critical, because a lot of times, like you said, Craig, you guys get there weeks, months, even years before we get there. So having photographs, and it's not like years ago where you had to pay to have them developed. Digital pictures are cheap. You can take a boatload of them. Nobody cares. Make sure they're in focus, and make sure that you kind of start far away and get close, so you can go back 2 years later and figure out where that crack was or what you're looking at. And the second tidbit is this: no matter what, the building and the physical evidence never lie. People sometimes lie. Sometimes they get mixed up. They don't remember, particularly if you're there days after the tragedy. You're seeing people on the worst day of their lives, and they don't always get the details down, but the building will never lie.
that's 100% true. And you made there was a point where you had to go take those rolls of film and get them developed. So everything's digital, and it's very easy to take thousands of photographs, and it's highly recommended that every adjuster out there, property or flood, make sure we're documenting that information. So, all right, Erik, thank you very much. Everybody, so we are only a few episodes away from the end of Claims Corner for this season, but we'd like you to join us in 2 weeks, and we're going to go back to damage identification. Our speaker in 2 weeks is Ryan Knight with Knight Solutions. He's going to talk about roof inspections, hail issues, things like that. As we're that's where we've talked about the flood and the wind here with Erik and his identification. Now we're going to reach out with Ryan, and we'll look at some hail. We'll look at some wind issues on roofs and get a little more specific into the roof inspection process. On the 29th, July 29th, we will discuss commercial claims complexity, which will be a very interesting one, especially when it comes down to the commercial claims handling on the flood side and the difficulties that go along hand in hand with that. August 11th, we're going to have Trip Sullivan, who will give us a different perspective on customer service and how we can apply tips into the insurance industry. And then finally, on August 25th, we'll have GWE, and their topic is sweaty walls. See, I knew I was going to say that. I knew I was going to follow that SNL skit, but it's sweaty walls. So, all these would be great episodes to catch live if you're able to join us. And if you're not able to join us, you can watch later on as we record these. We'll edit these and we'll drop these on our YouTube channel for later on for reviewing again. With that, Erik, again, thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. We really appreciate it. And everybody, y'all have a fantastic week.